Philip, I did my PhD in neurophysiology because I wanted to explain consciousness. 60-odd years ago, I enjoyed the process. I didn't learn anything about consciousness, of course. I was dealing with thalamocortical circuitry. And if I'm in that mindset, how would you, if we're meeting for the first time, argue that panpsychism is the view that we should take? What are the arguments for panpsychism?
Do you know, I think where I'd start is to try and emphasize that when we're dealing with consciousness, it's not a purely scientific issue. The science is absolutely crucial, but we need to be working both on the science and the philosophy to make progress on consciousness. And I think these are quite different tasks as I see it. So I think the scientific task is to try and identify which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of conscious experience, and we've made significant progress on that. But all of that scientific data leaves open, well, why? Why does brain activity correlate with consciousness? Why does consciousness and the physical world connect up at all?
Yeah.
And I think it's at that point we need to turn to the philosophy, and we need to just explore the different possibilities. One possibility.
And a critical point would be that if you have a physicalist total mindset, that you reject that because there'd be no need. But that imposes a philosophical bias or foundation on the process of understanding consciousness. So what you're saying is free yourself from the foundational physicalism, and not reject it, but at least allow other things to engage.
Yeah, well, you know, I think people do have this idea that physicalism is the scientific option. But I'd reject that actually, because all of these philosophical options, physicalism, panpsychism, dualism, at least in certain forms, are empirically equivalent, right? Which means we can't do an experiment to work out which is correct. For any scientific data, each theory can account for that data. They just do so in a very different way. So we're left with this puzzle. We can't distinguish these experimentally. What do we do? One option is to say, well, we should just be agnostic. If you can't do an experiment, you should just say we don't know which is true. But then don't say you're a physicalist. Right? Don't say you're a physicalist. Say, I just don't know whether physicalism or panpsychism or dualism is true. So that's the agnostic option. The other option is to see, are there other ways of trying to evaluate these different options apart from doing experiments? In other words, can we do some philosophy? And I think there are. And I think when we try to evaluate these different options, I think there are certain advantages to the panpsychist option.
Okay, so let's go through some of those philosophical arguments for panpsychism.
So at the core of this, we've got this problem. How do consciousness and the physical world connect up? The physicalist says, well, the physical world is fundamental and consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain. The panpsychist does it the other way around. They say, no, consciousness is fundamental and physical reality emerges from some more fundamental story about consciousness. So we just have to explore these different options and think, how well have these explanatory projects gone? In terms of the panpsychist project of trying to account for the emergence of physical reality in terms of consciousness, I think actually we've worked out how to do that. In a sense, the mysteries are solved. And here we draw inspiration from very important work of Bertrand Russell in the 1920s. And Russell's great insight here was that physics is just mathematical structure. And so in a sense, physics doesn't care what's at the bottom of reality. All physics cares about is that it has the right mathematical structure. Whatever's down there at the base of reality, as long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to get physics out of that. As Stephen Hawking said, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. So contemporary Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychists draw inspiration from this. And they theorize that at the fundamental level, we have very simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways. And through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures. And then the claim is, those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. It's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. And so in this way, we get physics out of some more fundamental story about consciousness. So I think we can't get consciousness out of physics, but we can get physics out of consciousness. Bertrand Russell taught us how to do that.
What does that say about the reality of the physical world? Because what you just described can just as easily as I hear it describe idealism, where there's only consciousness and the physical world emerges out of that consciousness.
Yeah, and with all of these terms, it sort of depends how you define it. If by idealism you just mean at the fundamental level of reality, it's purely mental or consciousness involving, then my panpsychism is a kind of idealism. But very often, idealists, at least contemporary idealists, have more of an idea that the physical world doesn't exist or is not fully real.
Yeah.
I would reject that. What I like about panpsychism is that maybe it's a little bit closer to physicalism. It says, no, the physical world is real. Physics gets its causal structure completely right. It's just that there's something that fills out that causal structure, something that breathes fire into the equations, namely conscious experience. So you get the best of both worlds.
So fundamental physics right now, we have a standard model of particle physics, which nobody thinks is the most fundamental, but it works well. You go down below that, and maybe you have string theory. You certainly have quantum field theory, which their particles are not fundamental, but they're excitations of the quantum field. You have the four forces of electromagnetism, gravity, the weak and strong force with it, and the atomic nuclear. Those are the four forces. So where's consciousness at all? Is consciousness another? Is that the fifth force?
Yeah, it's interesting you raised that. I had a long-standing interaction with the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder on this. So her thought on panpsychism was, well, if particles have consciousness as well as mass, spin, and charge, then it would show up in our experiments. It would refute the standard model. But that's actually a misunderstanding of panpsychism. We're not saying that consciousness is some extra property of particles alongside the physical properties. The idea is that the consciousness story is a deeper story underlying what physics has to tell us. So physics tells us about these wonderful mathematical structures. I'm not touching them. I'm not telling I'm not telling physicists what the mathematical structure of the universe is. What I'm proposing is a philosophical interpretation of physics, a philosophical interpretation of what underlies those mathematical structures.